welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at the type tool and some of the options under the type tool, and then we'll also be looking at some of the options that are available under the width tool. There's warp, twirl, pucker, bloat, etc. These are additional ways we can manipulate the shape of objects, and so we're going to be looking at these two sets of tools today in this tutorial. So, Illustrator is frequently used to do text-based things, and I always think it's funny when I create a tutorial series and then the main tool that people use it for I don't introduce until later. But the type tool it's pretty easy to use if you've worked with word processing programs before or any other type-based program. The things work pretty similarly, but then there's some cool options you've got in Illustrator as well because, it is a design tool. So let's start with just the basic type tool. Once I select the type tool, you'll see I get something that looks somewhat like a cursor. And if I just click once, it's going to create some text, right? And it gives you this default text, this lorem ipsum, which if you're not familiar, when people are doing design work for text documents, there's this default text that always gets used. It's just some Latin phrases. It doesn't really matter, but it's just there until the copy is written and can be added to the document. So it's going to start with just that word there. And this bar pops up here. Also note in the properties panel over here, there's a whole bunch of options. But so Myriad Pro is the default font. The default size is going to be 12 points. And it's going to be regular. So, this drop down allows me to choose between fonts. The drop down next to it allows me to choose if there's different things in what's called the font family. A font family is like if it has italics or bold or thin or whatever other options there are. And for this case, Myriad Pro just has regular and bold. And then over here, there is the actual font size. 72 is the biggest default size that you can choose. However, you can also just select the text in here and you could say, let's do 200 point, So we can make it much larger. And I'm going to suggest you leave it at 200 points. And then the last setting that's available in this little bar is the fill color. So we can set this and you'll notice that it turns blue. And that's because, when it's selected, it's going to be the opposite color of what you've chosen. So if I then go ahead and deselect that, you can see that I've got magenta text now. Something to note with the type tool selected, you can hover over this text anywhere and click and it'll drop the cursor there. So you can delete or add text or whatever you need to do. We're going to go ahead and just write a few words in here. I'm just going to say hello, and then I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to type capital A, capital V, and there's a reason for that. And that should be all that we really need to kind of go over some of the other settings that are available with text. Okay, so first, if I was to go ahead and change my font right now, let's say it doesn't matter what font you choose. I want you to note that I have a bunch of fonts that I've downloaded that may not be the default, but any of them that have numbers next to them in parentheses, those are the ones that have font families, So this Acumen Pro Wide has everything from thin to extra light all the way to ultra black italic. I'm going to go ahead and just choose ultra black italic. And I want you to note that, it's changed here. However, nothing has changed here. And that's because the type tool keeps track of the font that you're using as it goes through the text, So wherever my cursor was is where this new font is going to be applied. If I want to apply the font, I'm going to undo that. If I want to apply the font to the entire thing, I can hit Command or Control A to select all, or I can just click and drag to select all of that text. And then I can come up here and I can go down to wherever that font just went. Oh, there it is up at top. It moved up top. And I can go ahead and come in here and I can say, all right, I want to do this ultra black italic, for the entire font. Okay, so that's how I can adjust those things. In order to get out of text mode, typically, if I wanted to go into to be able to select something, the letter V is my shortcut key. But obviously, if I have my cursor live, it's going to not use the selection tool. It's going to create a letter V. So what I need to do to get out of the type mode is hit the escape key on the keyboard. And that's going to automatically put me back into selection mode. And then I can select this as an object. When I select this as a whole object, I want you to note a couple other additional options pop up here. So first, there's this option to outline the text. We're not going to do that yet. That's what would be called a destructive change, in the sense that I can no longer go in and edit which characters are on the screen, right? I can't change words, because what it's going to do is it's going to make an outline, essentially an individual object for each one of these letters, that's going to open up some other things we can allow us to change the text in a different way. And we're going to look at that a little bit later in the tutorial. The other option here is to turn this into area type. And we're going to look at that options in just a little bit, but I want to cover some of the settings for the appearance of the text that we can manipulate while we're still in type mode. So I've got this whole thing selected. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to add a stroke to it. And I'm just going to go ahead and add a black stroke, and I'm going to make it 10 points, right? So one thing I can do is I can definitely stroke text. I can also make the fill transparent, or have no fill in there. One thing you cannot do, even though it shows that I can have a transparent fill, while this is still type, I cannot get a transparent fill. It's going to make it a solid color. So it doesn't matter which gradient I use. And patterns, patterns will work, but gradients will not. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back to magenta. But that's just a note that when it's still a type object, you can't do gradients as a fill for the text. However, when you go and outline the text, then that's the opportunity you have to do a gradient fill. Okay, so we can also, with the stroke, we should be able to still do certain things like make, say, the stroke a dashed line. There's a couple options there. However, one of the things you cannot change is the profile. So I wouldn't be able to set this profile to any other shape, right? It's always going to be a uniform profile. I can adjust opacity and I can adjust the blend mode and all of that while it's still typed. Note that, again, I have the character menu up here and paragraphs and things that I can work with up top. Again, that's all available over here as well. And I want to go through some of the settings. I'm going to go through them over here on the side because they're all visible. You can also click right on the word character. You're going to get the same menu up there. Or you could go up to Window and go down and select the character menu, which maybe that's under type. I can't remember. I don't see it here. Maybe I'm just blind. But yeah, there's other ways. There's another way to get there. Okay, so if we come over here, right, we've already looked at the appearance, but if we look at the character, we've got our font size here, and then we've got a couple other options. So this is our line spacing. I believe it's actually called, what do they call it? If I can hover over this. For some reason, my pop-ups aren't showing up, but whatever. I don't remember the technical term for this. But you'll see that there's this option, this 169 points. That's basically like to have the lines really close together. Auto is going to set it at that 240 points as the default, and each font size is going to have a different automatic result. You can also go really small, right? So this is a 6-point difference. You can see the text is directly on top of it. You can also make it, right, substantially larger. If I was to say choose this 169, right, I can click in this field and I can type any value I want in there. If I wanted this to be 400, I could make it 400 to have those lines spaced that much. 169 is actually kind of nice for right now. And then we have a couple other options here. These things do similar actions, but you'll note that this only allows us to have auto, optical, or metrics, or 0. So if I click on 0, you're going to see it changes basically how Illustrator decides to apply spacing between these different characters. The reason they focus on the V and the A and the A and the V here is that it kind of shows these two characters are, the most obvious because, right, the top of the V could potentially start before the bottom of the A begins. And so we've got, optical, which actually looks pretty nice most of the time. Auto is the default. It kind of smushes things around. But then on this other side, if there's deeper changes that we want to make, that's where we can do it here, right? We can essentially squish all the characters together very, very closely, right? We can use any of these preset sizes. We can also, right, again, come in here and manually put in a number so we could have our text really spread out if we wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and say like we'll just say -10, make it a little bit tighter. And right, we don't have any special need for these things to be close together. It's just the way that we're working. If you've used any word processing software ever, this paragraph section should make sense, right? It's just going to change where the alignment is. I want you to note that, right, this is the starting point, and so the alignment is going to be based around that, not the center of the object. So there's a point right there on the wherever your first character landed, and that's where it's going to be centering all of this, which is why it looks weird, like it's shooting off the screen. And so we're just going to leave it set at the default setting. You can do numbers and bulleting too. We're not going to be interested in that. Also, right, all of these have the ellipsis there that allows us to get a couple more settings in here. The rest of these, right, there's just a few more options down here. I can, right, make the text really squished or stretched out, or just leave it at 100%. And again, I can make things like a little bit wider if I really want the text to be a little fatter. Obviously, the more you go, the more warped it looks, but this is a really nice way to get some more variation in the font that you're working with. We don't have any superscript, but it basically says how high should the superscript be lifted. And then character rotation, right? We can get it so that all the characters are right at an angle. It looks like they're kind of dancing here, but right, you can set all the characters to an angle, including all the way upside down. So those are a couple other options. And then you can either set things to be all caps, right? You can format it so it's small caps, which maybe we'll keep that. And you can tell whether it should be superscript or subscript. You can underline the text. You can do a strike through on the text. And then this is the language it should be using. And then the anti-aliasing method, basically how should the text be rendered? We're not going to worry about that too much right now. And then you can basically say where should that snap be. Remember I said it's right here at this bottom corner. That's the baseline. If I click here, it's going to snap when you're moving it around, it'll snap to this center line. Yeah, and so there's a couple options there that you can highlight. You can also say where are the bounds for the glyphs, and then are there proximity guides, et cetera, et cetera. These are all more things that are more specifically focused on working with type a lot. You may need those tools, but for this tutorial, we don't need to go into that much depth. Okay, so let's say that we've made as many changes as we want to this text, and we're ready to go on. We want to create outlines. That's going to be what we're going to do next, but I want to show you some of the other type tools before we get to that stage. So if I select the type tool again, one way I can create area type is I can just click and drag to create a rectangle, and then the text will be fit in there, and based on how large it is, it may overflow the box, right? This should say lorem ipsum. However, it's just saying lorem, and you can see that the has been positioned over here because this is just a little bit too small. So if I was to go ahead and use my selection tool, one of the things you'll see is that now I can go ahead and I don't know why it's not letting me manipulate this at all. That's weird. Okay, so for some reason, when I went to manipulate the corners of this, I couldn't, right? I couldn't actually do this, right? Basically, I only could select and move the object around. I could not do anything else with it. And this is an issue that arises sometimes and can be really frustrating. So the way that you fix this is you would go up to View and you would go down to, so for whatever reason, this is the state I was in, right? I'm clicking on these things, right? Nothing's happening. What happened is, for whatever reason, and I may have hit the wrong key on the keyboard or something like that, but what I need to do is I need to show the bounding box, right? And I don't remember hitting that key combination at all, but right, for whatever reason, it switched and the bounding box was off. So if I click on this show bounding box, now I can make adjustments here, right? So I can scale my box up, I can move things around and make some changes. Okay, so I've got this type area, right? And so now what I need to do is, right, it just says lorem. If I was to go ahead and type out ipsum, you can see that now I've got, right, 2 words here. Again, if I scale this down, you'll see that if I make the box too small, right, that lower text line is going to disappear, and I'm going to get this red plus sign. That little red plus sign down there basically is just a visual indication that I'm not seeing all the text in the actual box, right? And so I can do things, I can rotate this box, but I want you to note, right, rotating the box is not rotating the text, it's just rotating the container for the text. So that's just something to be aware of, right? In this current state, let's see if I can get this close to, that's reasonably close to whatever. I could probably just undo a couple of those. There we go. Right, it allows me to make a couple minor changes here. I can also, if I hover over this blue point, what this does is it switches it back to this text mode, right? So I can switch between the two if I double click on this, and that's pretty much all we need to really worry about at this point. So let's go ahead and look at other ways we can use type areas. So I'm going to go ahead and use my pencil tool, and I'm just going to sort of draw a blob. I don't want any of this to like really intersect with itself, although I did make a little mistake there, but I'm going to try and get this all connected. And then I might use the smooth tool just to smooth things out, and I'm just going to use the slider that's up here to soften some of those hard corners. Right, so I've got this I've got this space here, and what I'd really like is for text to fill in this space but not go outside of these bounds. And so what I can do is I can go to my type tool, and I can go to my area type tool, and then I can come over here, I can hover on this path, and I can click, and you can see it's going to start dropping characters in there. Now in this case, this font size is massive. Let's go ahead and make this substantially smaller. We're going to go ahead and go to, let's just go to 24 point. And if I go ahead and just start typing. Now, one of the other issues with this type area is that my spacing between lines, right, did not update with my font size, right? So it's still set at 169 points. If I go ahead and make this auto, I'm going to have a better result than if I did something else. And now this looks a little bit better, right? I can actually fill text in here. And so you can see that, right, how a type area can work, right? It takes a little bit of playing until you get your font size right and everything else. But if I was just to go ahead and copy and paste all of this somewhere, right, you can see that it's following the edge of the shape. For small details like this corner, it's really going to depend on, right, if they're how I space words, right? And note when it does a jump like this, because it can't quite fit there, it'll expand a space, or it'll just shift characters over, or if they're an entire word, it's going to jump the whole word over, right? Like if I put one more character here, that F is going to kick the entire thing over. So there's a couple things to just be conscious of when you're working with that. One of the additional settings under paragraph is the ability to hyphenate down here. So if you turn on hyphenate, then it should, if I go ahead and continue typing a word here, right, it will hyphenate it before kicking the rest of the word over here, right? This shape is probably terrible for actually putting text in, but I wanted to show you how that type area works. And you can put that in any shape that you've created as long as it's closed. Now, one of the other tools, I want you to note there is the vertical type tool, vertical area tool, and vertical type on a path tool, right? So those are other tools that allow you to do the same thing, but the text is going to read vertically. So let's go ahead and do type on a path. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the curvature tool to create a curve real quick. Right, so let's say I do that and I want it to sneak around here, and then I'm going to go up. I'm going to use the selection tool. I'm going to go ahead and turn the fill off. I am going to turn the stroke on, and I will make that beautiful orange color. And we're going to go ahead and make the stroke like 20 points, just so it's really visible as to where that is on the screen as we put our text on here. And so then we're going to go ahead and we want our text to run along this path. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down. I'm going to go to the type on a path tool. And I'm going to hover over this path, and I'm going to click, and you'll see that now it has run this along here. And I want you to note that, right, when it does that, it also automatically disappears the stroke. So if I wanted this shape to have a stroke, I would probably need to copy and paste it before doing this operation. Okay, So then when I'm in my selection mode, I can hover over these endpoints here, and there's a couple different things that happen, but we're not going to worry about that square right now. What we do want to worry about though is right below that, if I hover over, you can see I get a little arrow symbol. If I click on that, I can actually adjust where the start point of this text is. If I come over here to the end, I can adjust where the end point is, and you'll see it's actually, not squishing words over any, it's just getting rid of the additional words and letting me know that there's more text here that isn't fitting in the area that I'm currently using, right? So I've got this, so I can do, right, type on a curve. Now, I can also do this on any other shape, so just quickly, right, I could create a polygon shape, and I could use the type on a path tool, click on that, and again, I'm going to get type all the way around that entire path. So that's pretty awesome. If I double click on type on a path tool, there are different options available. Again, any of these tools, if you double click on it, you're going to be able to find an effect. So if I want to change the alignment, right, I can say, oh, I want this to be aligned on the center. I want to preview that. And so now, although I can't really zoom in very easily without just hitting OK, right, so now instead of this being on the outside, it's actually aligned on the inside. If I double click on this again and change this to a sender and hit preview, right, it's going to kick it onto the inside of the shape more or less. If I do descender, right, if there were any G's or P's or any lowercase p's or anything that had a drop, it's going to adjust that. Again, in this case, maybe center works best. And then the effect, rainbow, skew, so you can see like it's actually smushing the text on the different things. 3D ribbon. There's all sorts of different effects you can use to how the text is placed on the path that you're using. And obviously it's going to really determine which way you want to do. And I want you to note you can also flip it, right? So if instead of reading this way, it's going to be opposite. And spacing, you can adjust, again, you can adjust the spacing for between the characters this way. Okay, so those are some ways that we can work with text and create all sorts of different things. So let's say that we have some text, but maybe we're working on a logo, or we really want to do something unique to the text, or we want gradients in here, right? There's some other thing that we want to have happen. If I go ahead and select this text, there's a couple ways that I can create outlines. One, I can click on the option here. You can also go up to the type menu, and under the type menu, you can choose fonts. There's all the other options and tools are here. There's a couple other things you can do that we're not going to cover in this tutorial. But what I can do here is I can go down and, where is it? Oh, create outlines is here, right? So I can also click create outlines. I can also hit Shift Command or Shift Control O to create outlines. And when I do that, you'll see that things change a little bit, right? If I go to my layers panel, which is open right here, and pop this open, you'll see instead of this being a type object, it's now just a group with a bunch of compound paths in it. So if I double click, I can go into the group, and then I can select each character individually. If I select, say, the H, and I don't want this to be uniform anymore, I can click and have my path be no longer uniform. If I go down to, let's go to the A, and let's say, I'm just going to bring this down a little bit and zoom in. Let's say that I wanted to make some changes to this. Let's say I wanted to smooth it a little bit. So I click on the smooth tool, and I can actually round all of this out, right? Anything I can do to manipulate an object, now I can do to manipulate each one of these characters individually. If I wanted to go to the puppet pin tool, or the free transform, puppet warp tool, excuse me, right? I can drop some points in here. Maybe we'll do 4 points, and I can stretch and warp and do whatever I need to do to manipulate this character in whatever way I see fit. Okay, so that's exciting and all. So now I want to show a couple other tools and ways we can manipulate things. So I'm going to go ahead and take the V, and I'm going to use some of these tools here. We're going to start with the Crystallize tool. And so what these tools do is they allow you to they do like some generative manipulation of the path. So the best way to describe it is just to hover over here and see what happens. So if I have that crosshair on the inside of the path with the Crystallize tool and I click, right, it's going to create essentially like an explosion or a crystallization out of the shape. If I go the other direction and press to the inside, you'll see that it's actually going to push into that shape. Now, you may have had a very different result from what I had because my width and height are set to 50%, although I do have this set to 100% intensity. So I believe the default, this is 100 by 100, right? And I got here by just double clicking on that icon, right? So now this is like much more massive and it's going to have a much bigger impact on the shape, right? And I want you to note wherever it hits, it's going to make an impact. So if I was to hover over here, it's actually going to go out right in all three directions. And you can see that if you click and drag, right, very quickly things go sideways, especially at 100% intensity. So if I was to again go back and say, let's make these 50 by 50, I can hit tab to tab between these fields, just as a heads up. And let's say I set my intensity to 20%, I hit OK. Right, so now I can click a little bit and get these spikes to happen, but I can also click and drag and have a little bit more control over how rapidly that goes, right? Now, sometimes when you do this, maybe you're happy with a lot of what's happening, but you get you get a little weirdness here at some of these points. This is where changes to the stroke can come in handy. If I do rounded corners, right, I'm going to get a much smoother result across the end. If I do if I do bevel, I'm going to get a different result. If I change my limit to like 100 or something like that, right, you're going to see I'm going to have these crazy big spikes off the ends here, right, because these corners are just so hard. And so this is a time where maybe you go in and say, okay, these are too intense. So maybe what I want to do is I want to come in here and for some of these points, I either want to see if I can smooth that a little bit, which actually made things worse, or maybe I just need to open those points up a little bit. So I'm going to select one of these. And if I start to pull this out, you can kind of see as soon as I start to widen the angle that this is at, then I can start to get those spikes to actually appear. And again, in this case, they might still be too big. So maybe what I need to do is just kind of push these points in a little bit, which again would be part of widening these curves just a little bit more. And let's see if I can actually grab one of these handles. I might have to zoom in even more to get in there and actually grab the one that I want to grab, but it seems like for whatever reason, it is unhappy with me grabbing that. Yeah, so if I pull this out further, even though this line is technically overlapping itself, it's making the point a little bit smaller. I could pull this down and then shorten these handles some, which again should give a bit more control over the length of that spike, right? So if I want these to be a little shorter, I can, oops. In this case, that's interesting. It's actually pushing it out further. Let's go ahead and see if I can, there we go. If I pull this one in, it's gonna, right, a couple of these changes will help shorten it. All of these things, right, are based on each one of the points that they're aligned to. So you just have to, be cautious as it will affect the rest of your stroke, right? But so that can give you a little bit more control. Let's go ahead and look at some of the other options. And the reason I want to look at some of the other ones is, though most of these are pretty similar, there's a couple different settings in some. So if I go down, I'm going to go down to Wrinkle. Well, let's do Bloat first. Bloat is just fun. So bloats things, right? If I click, I get a lump. If I'm on the outside of the path and click, I get something that gets cut out. This is really great for doing things like if you wanted like bites out of a cookie or something like that, or tumors on your O. Oops, let's go back a little bit. Right, if you really want this to be a tumor. And with Bloat, you can also, if you click and drag, right, you can actually you can kind of use it as like a shape drawing tool. Oops, I keep messing that up a little bit, right? Because you can just keep just keep going and start using it as like almost like pushing clay around or something like that. So that was an O at some point. It is no longer an O. So let's go ahead and under Bloat, there's a few options. Again, you can adjust the size, you can adjust detail, you can simplify things. I can encourage you to experiment with all of these. Let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and select our we're just going to select one of these other letters. Let's just do the L. Oops, double click because I was out of there. Do the L, I'm going to zoom in. And this time we're going to go ahead and use Wrinkle, which is the very last option in there. Oops, that's the shape builder. Sorry about that. Here we go. Bloat's here. We're going to go to Wrinkle. And I want to double click and open up the settings for this. So my settings are not going to be set to the default. I do want you to note that the brush settings translate across all of the different tools in this menu. But I do want you to note that there is this additional set of wrinkle options, and wrinkle can be really useful. I'm just going to hit OK for now so we can see what happens. So if I click on this, you'll see I'm getting like a little bit of movement here. But if I click on the top surface, I'm getting a lot more movement along the top and bottom than I am getting on the edges. And that's if we go and look at our settings, because I have vertical set to 100% and horizontal set to 0%. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and set horizontal to 100% as well, and we'll just hit OK. And so now it should be going in both directions, right? I'm getting wrinkles in all directions, and this L is looking pretty nightmarish. I'm going to go ahead and undo some of these. There we go. So wrinkle at 100% is pretty, even with the intensity set to 20, right? It's doing a lot. If I was to set this down to like, let's just do 50% for both of these and hit OK. Right, this gives me a bit more freedom. And this is something where, right, maybe for like a letter like this, we're not necessarily, this isn't maybe exactly what we would want to do in the end. But maybe we do want this to be more wrinkled, right? So now this is wrinkled, but there's these crazy spikes everywhere. Because I want this to be like a rounded wrinkle, I can always select the smooth tool, right, and just smooth everything out just a tiny bit. And if that still isn't, if it's going too smooth and I'm not getting rid of those spikes, I can also go up to stroke and I can use the round cap tool and round corner tool. And that's going to help get rid of some of those like hard corners, right? So that's a really kind of easy way to get more of a hand-drawn feel to something you've made in Illustrator, where you're doing this kind of generative noise across the surface. If I change from the basic stroke to say, right, more of like a hand or a painterly brush stroke, then I can, ooh, 20 points is way too big. Let's do 3 points. There we go. Right, that wrinkling can help that. This is again far too large for this stroke. We could look at some other brushes, like if I go to artistic and artistic watercolor and open those up, we can select some of these and you can see that at 3 points, that's even far too large. Maybe there's one that's a little bit smaller. Even at 1 point, it's too big. Let's go to 0.25 points. Right, so I can get like a little bit more wiggle on here. You'll note that the brush kind of wraps around here, and that's showing that this wrinkle is actually folded back on itself. So I could come into this corner and zoom in and actually, right, work with these points a little bit. And if that's still not really making things good because there's some weird artifacting, I can just pull this corner in like that and get something that's a little bit smoother. I could always, right, use the smooth tool to smooth things out even just a little bit more on this, although I'd have to select all the points first. And now actually it's the entire thing. Let's go ahead and just select this and go to there. And now we can, right, smooth it out just a little bit more. Okay, so these were like the type tools, and then also how to manipulate letters once you've made them, and how to use some of these other options that were under the width tool that allow you to do some other things. You can test with warp and twirl as well, and pucker. They all have their uses. Again, usually the default setting of 100% intensity is too much. And so it's good to dial that down when you're working so you have a little bit more control. Okay, that's the end of this tutorial.